Today, we're back with another episode of the Executive Compensation Podcast. Today, I have Jeff Keckley, lead consultant at Meridian Compensation Partners, and Virginia Rhodes, partner and lead consultant at Meridian Compensation Partners with us. And today, we are talking about incentive plan design alternatives in an uncertain operating environment. So, Jeff and Virginia, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having us, Jake.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it.
So to dive right in, the last 18 months have been like none other. The impacts of COVID-19 pandemic has been wreaking havoc on business operations and company performance across the globe. So while many companies have rebounded from the major disruptions faced in 2020, others are still facing continued or new pressures resulting from disruptions in supply chain, increase in raw material pricing, shortages in labor, and other factors that are causing really continued uncertainty in the market. And so, for you guys, how are companies thinking about annual incentive plan payouts for 2021, particularly those that are still being impacted by COVID with supply chain disruptions or other uncertainties?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jake, and it's one that a lot of our clients are struggling with. I think many companies thought that with 2020 behind us and much of the pandemic, or at least the thick of the pandemic in our rearview mirror, that things would get back to normal much more quickly than they really have. So there's organizations that are still continuing to struggle in 2021 and possibly beyond. And it's having a real impact on how organizations are thinking about their financial performance throughout the end of this year. And of course, financial performance thus impacting annual incentive plan payouts for a large population throughout corporate America. Many companies are struggling with, as you mentioned, supply chain disruptions, labor market shortages, raw material price increases, and the like. And as such, it's creating a real bottleneck in the system. And as a result, organizations aren't able to meet all these orders that that customers have placed, or they're not able to produce that next widget because they don't have the supplies they need in order to do that. So as a result, companies are faced with financials that are not meeting budgets, where they thought they were going to be able to sell all their inventory or produce that one extra widget. They're no longer able to do that this year. So when comp committees are having these conversations around financial performance as we close out this year, many management teams are coming and saying, well, we would have been able to meet them. However, we didn't have the drivers, or we didn't have the materials, or we had to go purchase our own ships to meet inventory calls. So corporations are having to think about this much like they thought about payouts for 2020. Where would the performance have ended up had it not been for these disruptions that were unplanned, unbudgeted, and unforeseen? If the organization had all of the materials they needed, or if they were able to meet the demands that their customers were wanting from them, what would the results have been? Now, some of this has to do with how things might have ended up last year as to how committees are thinking about payouts for this year. For example, if an organization paid out well on their bonus plan for 2020, the committees may be a lot less sensitive to the impacts for this year. However, for some organizations, they didn't pay well last year, and they may not pay well again this year. So, what do we do about it? Now there's real retention concerns, issues of paying lower bonuses for 2 years in a row doesn't always feel right, and everybody's been working really hard. So committees are really struggling to figure out that balance.
That makes sense. And it seems it's like all those disruptions definitely creating lots of problems. And you see just the challenge with payouts. Like you said, if someone could have hit them, but they didn't. And so I guess another question would be, what about long-term incentive cycles that are ending in 2021 or even 2022? How are organizations thinking about these rewards, and are they considering adjustments to these or future plans?
Right. Yeah. I think for the long-term incentive side, we're going to see a different approach than we likely will for the annual incentives. And there's a few reasons for this. Right? I mean, first off, for companies that are using relative measures in their long-term incentive plan, such as a relative total shareholder return, then changes to the plan probably aren't necessary. I mean, assuming that you're using a comparator group that's appropriately structured, then those economic challenges are likely to have a similar impact to most of the companies within that relative group, and there's not as big of a necessity to make any changes. But if we look beyond those relative plans, there's likely companies that have multiple long-term incentive kind of performance awards that are outstanding, that are in cycle, that are tracking, that could be tracking well below maybe what was budgeted or previously expected, 12, 18 months ago, given the impact of COVID and some of these other economic events that we're discussing. And couple that with the fact that maybe last year's LTI plan or the performance award portion of last year's LTI plan likely had a lower than expected payout. And this kind of combined with the projections for the current in-cycle awards, can be concerning for companies and boards. And especially if for most of these companies, the performance award piece of the long-term incentive plan is 50% or 60% or more of the total LTI value. So there really can be some retention concerns here. I'd say there's a few different approaches to the long-term incentive, but most of the actions we're going to see are likely more forward-looking, looking out into the next cycle into 2022, and not necessarily making change to the awards that are currently in cycle. For example, it's rare to reset the performance award goals mid-cycle, these long-term performance awards. There's accounting implications to this. It's viewed negatively by investors. In fact, ISS recently published their annual policy survey, and they had a question on this. And this survey goes out to asset managers, large institutional investors, and over half of the investors that responded to this survey on the question about whether or not companies should be making mid-cycle adjustments to long-term incentive plans, the response that the investors continue to view this as problematic, even for companies that are negatively impacted by these events that we're talking about. So the expectation is, externally, investors, proxy advisors, they're going to continue to scrutinize these types of adjustments. We're likely to see some companies making adjustments to these uncontrollable factors in the results, in the performance results calculations. So not adjusting the actual goals, but at the back end and determining the payout, making adjustments for things, such as raw material pricing or supply chain disruptions, and trying to determine what the payout would have been if they're able to exclude these pieces from the calculation. The challenge here is in quantifying the impact, right? It's very difficult to determine what the results would have been if you exclude some of these economic challenges. And in addition to that, in order to be able to exclude these from the calculation, you would have had to define that at the beginning of the performance cycle. It would have had to been built into the plan, and it's likely that the adjustments are going to be fairly narrow. So we may see some companies using this approach, but not that many are probably going to be able to use this as a lever. Also, if you talk about discretion, it's very rare to see any type of discretion used in these long-term incentive plans as well. Again, there's negative accounting and disclosure implications to that. So for these reasons, we would expect companies to look forward to 2022 and to consider these issues when kind of structuring the pay moving into the next year.
That makes sense.
Jeff, yeah, just to add to that, I think you make a great point around the accounting and disclosure implications on the long-term plan and the use of discretion there. I do think there's a lot more latitude on short-term plans, and we saw that play through in 2020 as well. The proxy advisors seem to be a lot more sensitive to adjustments made in the short-term plan due to these uncontrollable factors. And this is frankly a bit of a new way of looking at things and kind of a more reasonable approach because of the unprecedented issues that companies have faced over the last 18 months. So I do think that there will be more discretion used on the short-term plan, more adjustments that are being put forth to try to get at some of the uncontrollable items that are flowing through the financials. And committees are having to think really hard about what's reasonable and fair. And I think they have much more latitude to do that on the annual incentive plan than they do in the long term.
Those are great insights. And so as we think ahead, what can companies proactively due to address some of these continued uncertainty in the market with respect to incentive plan designs. And maybe let's start with those annual incentive plans.
Yeah. So again, I think there's flexibility in both the annual and the long term, and you have a lot more flexibility on a go-forward basis than you do trying to fix or adjust cycles that are ongoing. So for the short term, there's a couple of things that a lot of organizations even put in place for 2021, but many are now considering either putting it again in place for 2022 or starting anew if they didn't make change and still have a more traditional program. The first of which is considering widening the pay and performance goal ranges. So you set a target, it's typically around your budget. Then it used to be that you set some percentage around target, maybe it's 90-110, maybe it's 80-120, around that target to set your threshold and your maximum performance levels. Well, these days, organizations have said, that may not be wide enough, and we may need a little more of a soft landing on the downside, and we might need a little more stretch on the upside, just given the amount of uncertainty and amount of volatility that still exists in certain markets. So widening those ranges is one approach. Delay in goal setting. Some companies, depending on when their fiscal year ends, are struggling to set even 12-month goals. Again, we saw this in some in 2020. We saw it again in 2021. We may see it in 2022, depending on the industry and how they're being impacted. So, instead of setting a 12-month annual incentive plan goal, you might set one half for the first half and one half for the second half. It gives you that additional visibility on line of sight. Depending on when the fiscal year end for those non-calendar year end companies, it allows them to have a little bit more visibility of months that may still be a little unstable. So it just allows the organization to have more information throughout the period that may be more within their control. The third approach that we're talking about with clients is the target itself. So on most annual incentive plans, you have, let's say it's an earnings goal and it's 100 million in EBITDA. Well, instead of setting that one number for EBITDA that's your target, we're seeing where companies are considering a range around that number. So instead of 100 million is your number, and then you plus or minus from there to get to your threshold and your maximum, you might see a couple percentage point range around that number, equaling a target payout. So again, it allows there to be some flexibility, some volatility that's inherent. It still allows you to meet that budget. It's similar to how organizations set ranges for guidance for EPS. It's between $3.40 and $3.45. And you're trying to come somewhere in the middle, but if you hit somewhere within that range, you've kind of achieved your objective. So I think annual incentive plan targets may also see some of that flexibility. The last thing, and we've talked a little bit about this already, but just allowing there to be some discretion, whether it be to Jeff's point on the front side, up front, baking in some flexibility in the way you're defining your goals, being able to carve out uncontrollable items, being able to put collars around pricing, providing some input on the front end of ways that the committee might look at performance on the back end. And also allowing that flexibility on the backside as well. I have lots of clients that miss their financials altogether, and it was for lots of reasons that were deemed outside of the control of management. And after much deliberation, the committee said, you know what, we're just going to pay at threshold. It's not a target year. We know that. Shareholders have suffered as well, but it's also not a zero payout year either. So having some of those really tough discussions at year end and talking through all of the items that impacted the financials, I think will be something we'll continue to see going forward.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that on discretion discussion, I think that there were some learnings after 2021 and seeing how companies applied discretion and how it was viewed externally, how investors and proxy advisors viewed it, and even companies that maybe applied the similar amount of discretion. There was less scrutiny around those companies that had that discretion component pre-baked into their plan, carved out so that the plan really was designed to allow for the committee to use discretion versus companies that didn't have that ability but applied discretion anyway, because that is something that the committee has the ability to do, even though it's not built into the design. And those, I think, those two different types of designs were viewed very differently, even though it might have gotten to the same spot. So there's some takeaways there as well.
That's great. And so how about the long-term plan? Are companies considering changes to the structure of long-term plans given the economic concerns we've discussed?
Yeah, I think there has been a number of different approaches or alternative approaches that are discussed on the long-term side. And some are similar to what Virginia just covered on the short-term side, where what pertains to goal setting or the structure of the performance curve in the long-term incentive performance award. I think other approaches being discussed is diversifying the number of metrics, adding additional metrics into the long-term incentive plan, really so that the value of the performance award is spread across multiple measures. We're seeing adding or increasing the weighting of relative measures. Most common is the relative total shareholder return or relative TSR measure, but just adding additional weighting on that measure might help to minimize the impact of the broader economic events on the incentive payouts. Though again, it's essential to make sure that you have an appropriate peer group if using a relative measure. There's also different levers that can be pulled in setting the performance goals. So for one example, if the uncertainty is expected to be maybe more short-term in nature, companies might consider measuring results in just in years 2 and 3 of a 3-year performance plan. So essentially skipping year 1 and measuring performance really on the back end of that 3-year cycle. Another approach that we've seen that helps to lessen maybe the extremes in the payouts is to base targets in year 2 and 3 on prior year actual results. So again, the performance goals would all be set at the beginning of a 3-year cycle, and year 1 would be based on an absolute value, but years 2 and 3 would be based on a growth percentage off of the prior year's results. And what that ends up doing is, for example, if year 1 results are poor, then the absolute target for year 2 ends up being lower because it's a percentage of year 1 results. Whereas if there's really strong performance here in year 1, year 2 actually requires some additional growth off of that strong performance. And this type of payout, this type of design, typically we see that it just results in a tighter band around payout or around target than maybe would be on a more traditional design. So again, lessening the potential of a zero payout or a maximum payout, at the extremes. Another approach would be to shift some of the long-term incentive weighting to RSUs or more of the long-term incentive weighting to a time-based RSU award versus the performance award. We know that ISS, the proxy advisors, tend to set a threshold of wanting at least half of your long-term incentive value to be in performance awards, but there's a number of companies that go well above that with their performance shares. And so we did see last year a shift of maybe a little bit more weighting in the time-based awards, the RSU awards for retention purposes. And so we expect that there are some companies that will continue to shift their LTI grants to more time-based awards, or those that already made that shift last year, having the conversation about maybe maintaining the similar weighting between RSUs and performance awards going into this year, just to continue to focus on retention. And then maybe from a sizing perspective, the actual value of the LTI awards, one approach would be to actually grant a larger LTI award to executives this year versus maybe what would have been done in a normal course year, maybe adding 25 or 30% to the actual value of the LTI award, acknowledging that some of the prior year awards or the in-cycle awards are tracking well below what was anticipated or maybe even expected to be forfeited. So, acknowledging that there was some events outside of management's control that are impacting prior payouts, and also adding an additional layer of retention by increasing the value of this award that's going to be outstanding for likely the next 3 years. And then finally, some companies are likely considering special retention awards although this is typically to select individuals, maybe those that are identified as being of a retention risk or high performers. And often when these kind of special off-cycle retention awards are granted, there's some performance contingency involved so that they're not just a strictly time-based award, but have some performance expectations to it as well.
Yeah, and Jeff brings up a lot of great points. And the one thing for many companies to think about is these are all kind of non-traditional ways to think about LTI. You know, we're used to having 3-year performance plans where you're really setting a growth expectation, or a heavily performance-oriented long-term incentive program that has a very little tie to time-based vehicles. We're just in a bit of a different environment right now, and as such, it's causing us to think a little differently and a little more creatively about how to keep management teams engaged, about how to not lose the critical talent, because we also know that many organizations are competing for talent like they've never done before. They're having to pay, significant sign-on bonuses. They're having to buy out significant amounts of equity from executives who have been at a company that has been performing well. They're having to pay a lot over market. It's just a crazy labor market right now. So a lot of these tools that we're talking about, particularly on the long term, may not be things that organizations have thought about for some time, but it's, in one of many categories that are kind of being put on the table for those organizations that are finding themselves struggling.
That's great. And so with this, how comfortable do you think companies will be using discretion in either their short or long-term incentive plans?
Yeah. Discretion used to be a bit of a 4-letter word in the compensation circles. Directors were pretty uncomfortable with it. They much more, they had a preference for more formulaic plans. The proxy advisors really didn't like it, or at least that was the perception. Institutional investors didn't know what to do with it half the time unless your disclosure was, so tight that it was very clear as to why you were providing something above and beyond your formulaic program. But I think the sentiment has changed. I think that particularly on the institutional investor side, what we've been hearing from a lot of the large institutional investors that they expect for comp committees to exercise discretion in certain circumstances. That's why they're there. They're there to make those tough judgment calls when the formulas just aren't making sense one way or another. It's also a lot easier for companies to use both negative and positive discretion these days on a short-term incentive plan. Jeff talked a little bit earlier about some of the challenges with respect to using discretion on long-term plans. But on the short-term side, we used to have kind of governors 162M regulations that kind of handcuffed companies, or at least they were perceived to handcuff companies on the use of positive discretion. Well, that no longer applies. So organizations, I think, are much more comfortable with putting forth recommendations, at least for consideration, on the use of discretion. And then the pandemic, of course, made that a lot more plausible and reasonable, at least to be considered from a committee perspective. We do find that having a framework to use is helpful, so that it's not just entirely subjective and something that that management puts forth and the committee kind of rubber stamps. It really does require a lot of conversation, multiple meetings of conversation. And there's also, various factors that should come into play. One should be, where would the financials have ended up? Where would your formula have ended up if you used no discretion? Where might it end up if you were to make certain adjustments to your financials that seem reasonable and appropriate? Is there a middle ground? Does it pull you over that threshold? Would it put you above target? Is there a governor that should be in place? For example, no matter what, we shouldn't pay out above target in a particular year when we use discretion. And what were some of the inputs that caused us to need to use discretion? This is not just about the impact of COVID. We've talked a lot about the pandemic and issues that are outside of management's control. But discretion is something that frankly all companies could consider in any particular year, depending on the circumstance. Oftentimes organizations that are going through major M&A transactions have to think about discretionary adjustments, whether they be up or down. There might be hiring challenges, or again, going to supply chain disruptions that have wreaked havoc on financials. So there's a lot of reasons that you might consider the use of discretion. But just like with anything that's outside of the plan formula, we'd want to make sure that disclosure was really tight around the rationale, because that's something that we know from an external perspective is going to receive high scrutiny. And as we saw last year, for those organizations that didn't put forth, reasonable and appropriate rationale, they were dinged by their shareholders, and the support on their say on pay struggled as a result.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point that Virginia just made, is that the structure, the type of discretion we're talking about is more structured use of discretion, not arbitrary discretion. And although that's typically the case, it's not always clearly disclosed. I think what investors are really looking for is explain why the discretion was used, and ultimately how do they come to the conclusion that they came to. And even companies that have strong rationale for that, if they're not clearly articulating that in the proxy, they're going to get some pushback externally.
This makes sense and leads kind of into our next question here, which is, from an external perspective, how are these changes to incentive plans viewed?
Yeah, I think that that's an important point to this conversation. And like we've talked about, I mean, there are some approaches that are just most certainly going to draw criticism from investors and externally. Things like using less than 50% of LTI value in the performance award, right? Having a majority of time-based award you're going to get some pushback externally on that. Making changes to mid-cycle to long-term incentive awards are likely going to be met with some criticism, and even upward discretion that's not pre-baked into the plan, and that maybe is a material increase over the formulaic results. There might be some pushback on that as well, especially if there's not a lot of transparency around the rationale for why those decisions were made. I think ultimately, it's important to just be balanced in some of these changes to the plans that we're talking about. I mean, the intention is, essentially to make changes to more closely align company performance to the ultimate payout that's received for some of these incentive plans. The purpose is not to necessarily to lessen the risk, or eliminate some of these maybe external impacts or environmental impacts that's outside of management's control, because frankly, there's a lot of things that are outside of management's control that influence the results of the incentive plans. And you're not trying to eliminate all of these, but just recognizing that some of these recent events, really have an outsized impact on the incentive plans. And there may be rationale to try to make some adjustments to eliminate the impact.
And I think Jeff brings up a great point there, that there's plenty of times where paying zero is appropriate. And the compensation committee has a really tough job to figure out which year this is, right? So there are always going to be things that are outside of management's control, and that's part of their job to manage. I think the question that's come up most recently in the last year and now almost 2 years is, at what point do we give? At what point does management deserve a little more credit than their pure financials from a budgeting standpoint produce? And one of the things that they have to keep in mind is the shareholder experience. So this is all great, but if shareholders are suffering, it's likely that the executive should also be suffering somewhat. If shareholders are doing well, but the performance isn't there from the operational side, then there's a little bit of a disconnect there. And, it has to, we have to scrutinize that and figure out, why there is that disconnect. So this is absolutely not about, to Jeff's point, taking out all of the risk, because, performance-based programs should have some inherent risk in them of failure. But what we're seeing now is multiple years in a row where things are just, like we've never seen. It's caused us to think a bit differently.
Yeah, I think maybe one additional point on this that we haven't talked about is it is really important to understand, even on the front end when you're setting these goals, what are the investors and analyst expectations to the goals, right? I mean, if even in these situations where there's a challenging economic environment, I mean, if there's a disconnect between where management is setting the performance goal, whether it's an annual plan or a 3-year long-term plan, if there's a disconnect between the target goals and the external expectations, that's likely going to lead to some external criticism, regardless of any of these other kind of structure changes that we're talking about.
That's great. And so as we wrap up here, are there any other factors companies should consider when setting 2022 annual incentive or long-term incentive goals?
Yeah, Jake, I think we've touched on a lot of them, but just to kind of summarize to Jeff's last point, organizations should be thinking about investor expectations when they set goals. It seems straightforward and common sense. They should also ensure that they're looking at performance on a relative basis, not necessarily baked into the plans, but just when setting the goals. If you're setting a 5% CAGR over a 3-year period, how does that relate to what you've done historically, to how your peers have performed in a similar kind of market basket of industries? Is that reasonable or is it stretch? So relative comparisons are also helpful. It's also helpful to test your curve, make sure that you've got the right slope in place. Are you sharing the right amount with your team versus what investors are taking home? And then your strategic plan is critical. Oftentimes I think companies get a little bit complacent on setting their budgets, and then they plus or minus a 10-20% range around it. Do sensitivity analysis. Test certain things that might happen or could happen or should happen or won't happen, and what does that do to the ultimate financials? So we often see lots of rigor around the goals themselves, but not as much around the threshold and max, which can be of critical importance.
That's great. Well, thank you both for taking the time to come on here. This was phenomenal. So appreciate you hopping on here.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.